The proconsul Valorous of the Cathar hegemony felt the familiar, low-frequency hum of the conclave floor resonate through his lower thoracic plates, a sensation that had always been intended to instill both solemnity and the crushing weight of imperial responsibility. Yet on this cycle, it was nothing more than an irritant against the smooth, polished ceramic. He stood, a creature of immense, multi-jointed stature, his eyes, complex, multifaceted lenses, sweeping across the tiered seating of the grand deliberation chamber, a colossal, dome-like space where the light of a simulated white star perpetually cast the assembled delegates in long, severe shadows. The air, meticulously filtered and circulated with trace elements of the Varlon sedative mist, was meant to keep emotions subdued and logic paramount, but Valorous could taste the metallic, bitter tang of fear and confusion that saturated the collective psyche of the gathered galactic powers. Before him sat the delegates of the Stability Compact, the coalition of civilizations that upheld the precarious, fearful peace of the known sectors, their forms ranging from the crystalline lattice structures of the Escarn to the dense, oil-sheened biological masses of the Xyloth, all united in their utterly baffled and increasingly angry assessment of the Sol system. The debate had stretched across a terrifying duration, fueled by an incomprehension that was fundamentally destabilizing to the hegemony's core doctrine of predictable, transactional power. The human enigma was not merely a military or political problem. It was a conceptual void threatening to swallow their established order. We have deliberated for 43 solar cycles on this singular point of failure, this anomaly which persists at the heart of our carefully constructed geopolitical matrix. Valorous projected, his voice a deep, modulated baritone that carried effortlessly through the vast chamber without need of augmentation, a mark of his lineage and authority. The Sol species, they call themselves humans, were presented with the Compact Edict, the terms of the Unified Defense Mandate, the absolute requirement for resource allocation and military contribution to the border stabilization effort. The border, I must remind the esteemed delegates, which holds back the incursions that threaten the very integrity of the Compact, the incursions which have consumed the entirety of the G-Thal Dominion and continue to encroach upon the territory of the SHY. Every sentient species of this quadrant has answered the call, sacrificing technology, population, and planetary stability for the greater collective survival. Yet, the Sol system, this minor, wet sphere of unstable atmospheric composition and biological fragility, refused. He allowed the final, damning word to hang in the chemically calm air, a single syllable of audacious defiance that had cost the hegemony more political capital than any active war. The refusal was not tactical. It was spiritual, and the Compact did not have a protocol for spiritual insubordination. A low, resonant clicking sound, the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath among the Escarn delegation, echoed from the upper tiers, a sign of extreme, disciplined agitation. A delegate from the Xyloth, a shifting, obsidian mass of semi-liquid sentience, extended a pseudopod, its movement slow and deliberate, a sign that the entity was struggling to maintain the meditative calm demanded by the setting. Valorous paused, allowing the weight of the refusal to settle into the collective consciousness, letting the silence amplify the unprecedented nature of the human choice. It was not merely a refusal to contribute a token force, nor an argument over resource percentages. It was a blanket, philosophical rejection of the entire premise of the Compact's existence, an act of such profound ideological sovereignty that it called into question the fear-based necessity of the hegemony itself. The humans had not just said no. They had said with calm, unwavering conviction, your entire premise of conflict is obsolete. They did not refuse out of weakness. Proconsul, which is the confounding element that continues to fracture our strategic unity, articulated the primary Escarn delegate, its crystalline form slightly refracting the white light, the sound of its voice a delicate, high-pitched harmonic, carrying a subtle wave of genuine intellectual distress. Our long-range passive scans, repeated across numerous observatory stations, confirm that their initial level of orbital defense saturation and localized atmospheric energy projection systems are rudimentary, almost comically inefficient against even a modest punitive fleet. Had they agreed to the Compact, their contribution would have been negligible, yet their refusal is absolute. The transmission logs confirm a fundamental dissonance. They spoke of the inherent fallacy of preemptive warfare and the moral bankruptcy of Rissauer. Sea-driven conflict escalation. They cited internal sociological data that suggested their own recent history of interspecies conflict was the only valid blueprint for their current policy, a commitment to internal unity and a total, unwavering abstention from galactic-level aggression. They offered, instead, agricultural and atmospheric scrubbing technologies, resources we did not ask for and do not require in the face of annihilation. The crystalline entity tilted slightly, a gesture of intellectual despair. They offered us aid, proconsul, when we demanded warriors. This is not logic as the compact defines it. This is an arrogance that borders on insanity, or a naivete that threatens to destabilize the entire compact doctrine by its sheer, successful existence. We cannot integrate a species that prioritizes the health of a single planetary biome over the necessary military apparatus of an entire quadrant. The very concept of their ethical isolation is a weapon against our political cohesion. Valorous nodded slowly, the intricate sensory filaments around his primary visual cluster trembling with carefully controlled frustration. The Escarn had precisely articulated the core dilemma. The psychological profile is the most damning component. They are not a culture of pure, unadulterated pacifism. Their history is rife with brutal, territorial conflicts, a terrifying spiral of self-inflicted wounds that should, by all known models of sentient evolution, have led to a ravenous, outward expansion of their aggressive tendencies. Yet they emerged from that primordial stage and within a staggeringly short span of time, mere centuries, achieved a level of unified, planetary infrastructure and technological cohesion that surpasses many of the Compact's older member species. They possess the capacity for profound destruction. The historical precedent is undeniable, but they have chosen to bury it under layers of defensive, benign technology. We cannot parse the motivation. If they are truly powerful, why do they not seize territory and demand tribute, as is the pattern of every rising galactic power? If they are weak, why do they provoke the Compact by refusing its core directive and risking annihilation? The human mind operates on a vector we cannot predict, and unpredictability, as we all know, is the true acid that dissolves imperial stability. Their very existence, unaligned and unconcerned with our war, posits an alternative to the Compact's necessity, and that alternative is the only true threat. The proconsul paced a short distance across the smooth floor, his gait measured, his mind struggling to reconcile the data with the Cathar doctrine of pragmatic coercion. The debate stretched across the simulated cycle of Saul's own planet, Earth, traversing complex arguments of compact law, historical precedent, and the logistical nightmare of maintaining a unified front with a deliberate, philosophical void in its center. Fear was simple, profound, and political. If Saul was allowed to maintain its absolute non-alignment, other, weaker or less disciplined sectors might cite its example, creating a ripple effect of secession that would fracture the Compact's ability to defend the border. The Saul species, by choosing not to fight the galaxy's war, was inadvertently inviting the annihilation of the galaxy itself through the subsequent political dissolution. The irony was a bitter draught that the delegates struggled to swallow. The Compact did not desire Earth's resources, nor its territorial space. It desired its compliance, its ideological submission, the removal of the existential threat posed by its quiet, absolute dissent. The very act of leaving them alone was a declaration of the hegemony's irrelevance. Finally, after the simulated dawn had illuminated the chamber for the third time, Valorous moved to the central point, the only remaining recourse, the logical conclusion of a fear-based political calculus. The Compact's existence is predicated on the elimination of instability. We offered the Saul species a choice of alliance, a seat at the table of power. They chose isolation. We offered them a chance to contribute to the greater safety of the quadrant. They chose ethical abstention. This refusal is no longer a matter of diplomacy. It is an act of political aggression by negation, a deliberate undermining of the collective security framework. We cannot allow this philosophical virus of non-participation to spread. The hegemony has therefore prepared the coercion mandate, a limited deployment of forces, calibrated not for annihilation, but for decisive, surgical demonstration. We will descend upon their primary world, their home system, and force them into compliance through the absolute display of overwhelming, focused military might. We will not commit genocide. We will commit an absolute, undeniable act of military superiority that will shatter their philosophical hubris and install a provisional government that understands the true price of galactic citizenship. They refuse to fight the galaxy. Therefore, the galaxy must bring the fight directly to them, to their own orbit, to their own atmosphere. The question is not if we act, but how we explain the necessity of this aggression to the wider, watchful quadrants, and the answer is that we act for the sake of the only true stability, the stability of the Compact's unified political will. The vote was unanimous, conducted not through vocal assent, but through the simultaneous activation of the delegates' personal command matrix emitters, bathing the chamber in a cool, emerald light. A declaration of absolute necessary war upon a system that had only asked, in the most profound way possible, to be left alone. Valorous felt a profound, heavy sadness in the moment of triumph. The Cathar doctrine was one of fearful pragmatism, not cruelty, and this act felt like the necessary amputation of a healthy limb that threatened to poison the entire body with its unnatural perfection. The coercion mandate was initiated, and the great ships of the hegemony, vessels of immense scale and terrible purpose, turned their trajectories toward the pale blue marble of the Sol system, carrying the grim certainty of a galaxy that had decided its stability was worth the sacrifice of a nascent civilization's principles. The void between the stars consumed the journey with the indifference of true cosmic scale. The fleet, commanded by the seasoned, unflappable Strategos Cathar, a distant relation of the proconsul and a military mind of legendary coldness, a mind that dealt only in quantifiable risk, comprised a punitive force of precisely the magnitude calculated to overwhelm any known terrestrial defense, yet strategically insufficient to threaten the structural integrity of the Sol world. It was a diplomatic gesture delivered with hypervelocity kinetic impactors, a calibrated threat designed to instill submission, not extinction. As the great, segmented hulls of the hegemony dreadnoughts and cruisers translated back into real space at the precise outer boundary of the Sol system's Kuiper belt, the first set of long-range sensor readings began to flood Caithar's command matrix, and the Strategos felt the first, subtle tremors of intellectual unease, a sensation far worse than the recognition of a clear military threat. The system was not what the analysts had predicted, not the disorganized scramble of a species frantically preparing a last-ditch defense. The expected chaotic band of mining outposts, the visible signature of a nascent, aggressive spacefaring power expanding outward for resources, was absent. Instead, the entire volume of the system, from the Kuiper belt inward toward the orbit of the fourth planet, was saturated with an impossibly dense, yet entirely benign, energy web. This was not a weapon network. The energy signatures were too low frequency, too diffuse, and completely lacking the sharp, focused spikes indicative of offensive plasma or antimatter containment fields. It was infrastructure, but on a scale that defied the hegemony's understanding of economic necessity. Vast, static orbital arrays, kilometers in every dimension, spun slowly, not transmitting data or projecting weapon fields, but somehow stabilizing the system's energy gradient. Entire asteroid belts had been meticulously disassembled, not for the crude extraction of metals, but to construct gigantic, gossamer-thin photovoltaic collectors that somehow gathered the sun's output with an impossible efficiency, yet seemed to send the power not to human settlements, but back toward the star itself, an act of stellar-scale resource cycling that seemed utterly nonsensical to a species that saw the star only as a finite resource to be plundered. The entire system was humming with the quiet, efficient noise of a civilization deeply, profoundly committed to something other than the accumulation of military power or territorial gain. Strategos, we are receiving passive return data on the Sol primary planet designated Earth, reported the sensor chief, an efficient, four-eyed Varl technician whose voice was normally a monotone of dispassionate data, but now held a discernible vibration of confusion, a subtle tremor of disbelief that registered immediately on Caithar's internal monitors. The atmospheric stabilization signatures are exponentially higher than predicted. The entire planetary biome is operating at an optimal engineered peak, a constant, managed state of maximum ecological efficiency. The magnetic field is augmented, not by localized pulse emitters, but by a vast, semi-permeable lattice woven into the ionosphere. We are detecting millions of localized, subterranean energy hubs, interconnected by a planetary-scale fiber-optic equivalent network that is impossibly dense and redundant. It is a level of unified planetary engineering that the Compact has only theorized as a final utopian scent. Age of development. They are not preparing for war, Strategos. They are cultivating a garden on a truly planetary, system-spanning scale, and every component of their civilization is dedicated to this singular, benign purpose. Caithar, his complex, chitinous face rigid with concentration, allowed himself a single, slow, mechanical rotation of his primary optical array. The sheer arrogance of the human refusal now began to shift its emotional context. It was no longer the arrogant defiance of a fledgling species, but the dismissive indifference of a power that had moved beyond the hegemony's fear-based concerns. He had come to administer a punitive lesson to a child. He was now standing on the doorstep of an architect who had completed a project he could not comprehend, and that project, by its very existence, invalidated his mission. "Initiate the first contact protocol military iteration," Caithar commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, forcing an adherence to the military script that felt increasingly absurd. "Send the standard compact demand. 3 cycles to comply or the demonstration begins. Do not deviate from the script. We must first establish the chain of authority, even if that authority is now in question. Let them know the full gravity of the situation they have provoked, the full weight of the compact's unified fear." The transmission was beamed toward the Sol system's center of gravity, a complex, multilingual ultimatum, detailing the compact's superiority, the necessity of the border war, the inevitability of human subjugation, and the absolute requirement for immediate resource and military contribution. It was a message designed to instill instantaneous, overwhelming fear, a tool of coercion that had never failed the hegemony. The reply arrived within a quarter cycle, an unnervingly calm, single-frequency signal that carried no discernible threat matrix, no evidence of panic, and no political counterargument. The transmission simply bypassed the hegemony's complex decryption protocols and manifested directly in the command matrix interface, projected as a clear, universally translatable visual and audio feed. It was a perfect, crystalline communication that showed an utter lack of concern for the hegemony's cryptographic superiority. On the screen appeared a single human female. She was seated in a room of minimalist design, illuminated by soft, natural light, with no visible weapon or defensive technology, only the subtle sheen of highly advanced, non-aggressive materials. She was dressed in an unremarkable gray uniform that denoted only professional function, not military rank. Her face was serene, her eyes calm, and her posture utterly relaxed, exuding an authority that stemmed not from coercion, but from total internal certainty. This was not a military commander, a desperate diplomat, or a fearful politician. This was a technician of peace, and her very presence was a critique of Caithar's entire career. "We greet you, strategos Caithar of the Caithar hegemony and the Stability Compact," the woman began, her voice a low, clear contralto that resonated with an almost unbearable sincerity, a voice that carried the weight of planetary consensus. "We are the Sol Stewardship, and I am Representative Liana, the designated interface for interspecies interaction. Your arrival was expected, though its motivation remains, upon review, strategically illogical and ethically redundant." Caithar felt a spike of genuine, frustrated rage, a desperate clinging to the authority he felt slipping away. "Illogical? You stand on the precipice of total war with the unified powers of the Compact, the greatest military alliance in this sector, and you speak of illogical motivation." "We speak of the origin of the conflict, strategos, not its inevitability," Liana responded, her gaze unwavering, entirely devoid of the fear that Caithar had been trained to elicit. "We have reviewed your demands. They are predicated on a political and resource scarcity model that we transcended centuries ago. Your war is a territorial dispute fueled by a fear of the unknown, a fear we understand from our own regrettable history. Our refusal to join that conflict was not an act of hostility against the Compact. It was a unilateral declaration of non-participation in self-destructive behavioral patterns. We simply chose to dedicate our collective energy to planetary and systemic stability, the work that actually guarantees long-term survival, rather than external aggression, which only guarantees long-term entropy." "Your stability is an insult to the Compact's sacrifice," Caithar roared, his voice now ragged with unconcealed fury and the strain of maintaining command in the face of this unsettling calm. "Your refusal has threatened the stability of the entire quadrant. You forced our hand by your ethical selfishness. You will comply, or you will be subjugated. We are here to administer the coercion mandate to SH. Utter your naive illusion of isolation. We will destroy your orbital infrastructure. We will land troops on your surface. You will submit to the rule of the Compact." Liana nodded slowly, a gesture of almost parental disappointment, a profound sadness that the hegemony could only resort to such predictable, self-defeating violence. We understand the function of a coercion mandate, but you mistake our abstention for weakness and our commitment to internal stability for a lack of external capacity. We refused the first fight, the one you wage in the outer sectors, because it was unnecessary and costly to our core directive. We will not refuse the second fight, the one you have brought directly to our home, because the defense of one's ethical autonomy and the integrity of a stable system is the highest form of self-preservation. You have crossed the threshold of peaceful non-participation, strategos, and that is a threshold we have prepared to defend with absolute, overwhelming force. We strongly advise you to retreat and reconsider the true cost of your intervention, for it will not be measured in ships lost, but in the catastrophic loss of political understanding. The sheer lack of fear, the almost monotonous calm of her voice, served only to fuel Caithar's military certainty. He saw not a formidable foe, but a species so steeped in its philosophical dogma that it had become divorced from the harsh, violent reality of the galaxy. Your advice is noted and dismissed, Caithar stated with finality, masking his increasing unease with the certainty of his firepower. This is the moment of your subjugation. Fire the primary warning volley, minimal power. Target the 3 largest orbital stabilization arrays. Let them witness the ease with which their garden can be scorched and the philosophical foundations of their isolationist dream reduced to vapor. The command was executed. From the main batteries of the hegemony fleet, 3 massive plasma bolts, each one capable of vaporizing a smaller moon, streaked toward the colossal, benign structures that orbited Earth. The beams traveled across the void with the speed of compressed light, carrying the terrible, cold weight of imperial authority, a gesture that had ended thousands of conflicts before they had begun. Every sensor on the Caithar bridge was focused on the point of impact, expecting the spectacular, terrifying explosion that would signal the collapse of the human defense grid and the beginning of the end. The explosion never came. As the energy bolts, each one a hyperdense, incandescent torrent of controlled stellar fire, neared the human orbital arrays, they did not impact the physical structures. Instead, they hit an invisible, impossibly complex energy field that was not a defensive shield in the compact's understanding of the term. It was not a reflector, nor a diffuser, nor a kinetic barrier. The human field, which was simply an extension of their system-wide energy web, absorbed the bolts. The energy signature of the 3 plasma strikes, enough raw power to sustain a small civilization for 100 cycles, was instantly, cleanly incorporated into the ambient energy web that permeated the Sol system. The immense, benign orbital arrays did not falter. In fact, the arrays targeted by the hegemony weaponry glowed with a momentary, barely perceptible pulse of energy, as if they had merely received a massive, unexpected recharge from an inefficient outside source. The kinetic force simply vanished, the plasma was neutralized into its base, stable components, and the immense, terrifying power of the hegemony's opening salvo was simply recycled into the human power grid, an act of perfect, sublime, non-violent efficiency. The 3 weapons' fire had not even created an echo of resistance. On the bridge of the hegemony flagship, an unnerving, absolute silence descended, a silence that felt heavier than the vacuum of space. The Varl sensor chief stared at his display, his 4 eyes wide with unquantifiable data, his previous vibration of confusion now morphing into a paralyzing fear. Strategos, the energy, it has been domesticated. It has been incorporated into their system-wide stability matrix. There is no damage, no deflection, no return fire. They have rendered our weaponry into a source of supplemental power, an inefficient but usable energy donation to their planetary-scale project. Caithar, for the first time in his long, brutal career, felt the paralyzing grip of true, existential terror, the kind that strikes when the fundamental laws of one's existence are revoked. The hegemony's technology was built on the principle of violence, the focusing of energy into a spear to pierce and destroy. The humans had built a system on the principle of sustainability, the ability to absorb any force, no matter how great, and utilize it for growth, to treat violence not as a threat, but as an inefficient input that could be corrected. It was not a defense, it was a different physics, a different philosophy entirely, and it was devastatingly effective. Representative Liana, Caithar managed, his voice now stripped of its command authority, reduced to a hollow, rasping sound that barely filled the silent bridge. What have you done? What form of weapon is this that can consume the power of the hegemony? Liana's calm expression did not change. The brief, almost imperceptible pulse of light on her screen faded back to the soft, natural illumination. It is not a weapon, strategos. It is a commitment to the optimal energy gradient of our system, a principle of absolute efficiency. Our civilization is structured on a singular priority, the maximization of efficiency and the preservation of our habitat. Your energy bolts were simply an inefficiently delivered source of fusion power that was creating unwanted, localized space-time distortions. We have, with great speed and economy of effort, simply corrected the inefficiency and utilized the power. We told you we had transcended the politics of scarcity. You did not believe us, and in your disbelief, you have powered our latest calibration effort. Then came the true, paralyzing revelation, the large-scale reveal that shattered the hegemony's entire doctrine of war and rendered the coercion mandate an act of galactic-scale folly. As Caithar struggled to process the absorption of his primary strike, the entirety of the hegemony fleet, every cruiser, every dreadnought, every support vessel, every drone, suffered a sudden, catastrophic loss of FTL capability. Not through explosion, or internal sabotage, or external kinetic impact, but through a slow, inexorable dampening of their warp fields, a fundamental, seamless negation of the very possibility of faster-than-light travel. Strategos, all FTL coils are reading a complete total energy nullification. The propulsion engineer screamed, the disciplined calm of the bridge now utterly dissolved into panic and confusion. The field integrity has collapsed. The dimensional containment is failing. We are inert in real space. We cannot jump. We cannot maneuver past sublight velocities. The very potential for warp travel has been neutralized. Liana was still watching, her calm eyes holding the immense power of her civilization, the gentle, ethical dominion over physics itself. The integrity of the Sol system's local space-time fabric is a managed resource, strategos. You entered with hostile intent, projecting high-energy FTL fields that violently destabilized our operational parameters and created unnecessary stress on the underlying geometry. We have, as a measure of extreme caution and systemic maintenance, contained the anomaly. You are not disabled by a hostile weapon. You are simply quarantined within a localized zone of ethical stability, a field that enforces the principles of nonviolence by negating the means of large-scale aggression. You may remain in the outer sector, but your capacity for violence or for escape at velocities that threaten systemic stability has been gently neutralized. You cannot leave the fight you brought here, but neither can you execute it. The hegemony fleet, the spear of the stability compact, was now floating, utterly inert and harmless, within the vast, humming garden of the Sol system, a fleet of devastating potential reduced to the status of a massive, immobile, and incredibly rude piece of orbital debris. They were not defeated by superior firepower, but by superior management and an ethics-driven mastery of physics that treated violence as a simple matter of corrected inefficiency. They had come to start a war, and the humans had simply calmly rendered the concept of war impossible within their domain. The arrogance of the Caithar had been met not with an explosion, but with a quiet, final competence. The philosophical vacuum created by Earth's initial refusal was now filled by the concrete, inescapable reality of its staggering, ethical power, a power so absolute it made the compact's weapons seem like toys. The next few Sol cycles were consumed by the hegemony's utter, desperate incomprehension. Strategos Caithar, his military authority now a hollow shell of his former self, was forced into a diplomatic status that stripped him of all pretense and all means of coercion. The compact fleet could do nothing. Their sublight drives were barely enough to maintain station-keeping. Their weaponry, if they chose to fire it, would simply feed the colossal, silent power grid of the Sol system. They were prisoners of their own aggression, held captive not by chains or kinetic barriers, but by the sheer, overwhelming philosophical and technological superiority of their enemy's defensive commitment, a commitment that had been mistaken for weakness. The ongoing communication sessions with Representative Liana became less a negotiation and more a series of deeply uncomfortable philosophical lectures delivered with a calm, unnerving patience that felt like intellectual torture to the rigidly structured Caithar mind. The human representative, without ever raising her voice or displaying a single outward sign of triumph, began to systematically deconstruct the entire political and military foundation of the Stability Compact, revealing its core assumptions to be fatal flaws. Your entire galactic structure is a house built on a single, shared assumption, Liana explained during one particularly intense, cross-system transmission between the inert flagship and the planetary surface. The screen behind her now showed a complex three-dimensional projection, not a star map, but a detailed rendering of the Sol system's internal energy cycling pathways, a web of astonishing complexity. You assume scarcity. You assume that resources are finite, that territory is essential, and that control over your neighbors is the only valid guarantor of security. This assumption necessitates a standing military, constant political tension, and the periodic bloodletting of the border wars to maintain the illusion of stability, all of which are immense, non-recoverable drains on your collective resources and technological potential. Caithar, now seated and slumped in his command chair, surrounded by the silent, dejected faces of his senior staff, could only ask the question that clawed at his professional soul, the question of absolute necessity. We defend ourselves against existential threats. The border war is real. The incursions were eliminating entire sectors. How can you dismiss the necessity of survival and the defense against absolute annihilation? Liana's expression softened, showing a fleeting trace of what Caithar identified as pity, a terrible, humiliating emotion from one who had mastered a higher form of reality. We do not dismiss survival strategos. We simply calculate the true vectors of existential risk. Your border war is a symptom, a fever caused by an internal political infection of fear-based resource allocation. It is a consequence of ancient, destructive behavior, not a true cosmic inevitability. We watched your cycles of conflict, and we saw a constant, self-destructive pattern. New military technology creates a momentary advantage, which forces the opposing side to commit maximum resources to counter-development, leading to a perpetual, accelerating arms race that consumes all available planetary capital, preventing the truly essential work of deep, systemic stability, the work that actually guarantees long-term existence. She gestured toward the complex light map behind her, the humming, quiet majesty of the Sol system's managed energy. When we achieved planetary unity, our first act was not to build a fleet, but to conduct an absolute, total system resource and energy audit. We found that the greatest existential threat to our species was not an external alien incursion, but the long-term thermodynamic instability of our own sun and the inherent geological volatility of our home world. We realized that all the military might in the universe could not save us if our sun began to falter, or if our core dynamics shifted catastrophically. The greatest danger was not the unknown, hostile other, but the known, indifferent cosmos and the entropic decay of our own local spacetime. This was the core of the human reveal. Their true power was not in a super-weapon, but in a super-priority, an absolute, collective commitment to the necessary over the political. The massive orbital infrastructure, the incomprehensible energy cycling, the non-weaponized defensive web, it was all designed for planetary maintenance and stellar stability, the only forms of defense that actually mattered in the long arc of cosmic time. They had dedicated their entire civilization not to fighting others, but to ensuring their own indefinite, peaceful existence. Their refusal to join the Compact's war was the ultimate expression of this priority. They simply could not afford to divert even a fraction of a percentage of their total resource output from stellar engineering to meaningless galactic politics, which they perceived as a suicidal waste of potential. You came here to force us into your war, strategos, Liana concluded, her voice low and absolute. But the moment you did so, you initiated the only conflict we were willing to fight, the defense of our ethical and technological autonomy, the defense of the necessary work. We chose a world without war, and we have created a technology and a philosophical structure that enforces that choice. You were not defeated by plasma cannons. You were defeated by the superior efficiency of a civilization dedicated to survival over conquest and the superior foresight to choose the correct enemy. The subsequent negotiations, held not on the hegemony flagship but aboard a human-built orbital habitat called the Archimedes Station, a structure of pristine, self-sustaining grace that felt less like a station and more like a carefully manicured ecosystem, were a study in diplomatic inversion. Caithar, now acting as an unofficial emissary, was forced to confront the immense political cost of his failure. Proconsul Valoris, back in the Grand Conclave, had to manage the unprecedented crisis of having the Compact's punitive fleet rendered inert by a philosophical position backed by unquantifiable technology. The political pressure from the Compact's member species was immense. A mixture of outrage and dawning, terrifying realization that the hegemony had been profoundly, absolutely wrong. During one pivotal session aboard the Archimedes, held in a panoramic chamber that looked out onto the tranquil, cloud-swept face of Earth, Liana presented the hegemony delegation with a set of cultural and technological exchange data. She detailed the Sol Stewardship's core social operating system, a global, non-scarcity economy managed by an advanced, neutral AI dedicated only to resource distribution and optimization, a planetary energy grid that harvested and recycled virtually all power, with an energy overhead that made the compact's fission and fusion generators look like primitive fire pits, and a social compact based on guaranteed stability and universal education, which had, over 300 years, systematically eliminated all large-scale internal conflict. The Sol system was a living, breathing proof of concept that the hegemony's entire fear-based structure was obsolete, a relic of a primitive, resource-limited mindset. Your civilization has stabilized itself, human, admitted a high-ranking Cathar strategist, his voice heavy with reluctant admiration, his pride crushed by the irrefutable data. But you cannot ignore the external reality. We fight for stability, yes, but we also fight against the threat of utter collapse. The entities beyond the border are merciless. They consume entire biospheres. Your ethical autonomy will not save you if they turn their attention to your perfect garden world. You cannot manage a threat of that magnitude with quiet efficiency. Liana looked at the strategist with a piercing intensity, a look that conveyed centuries of unshared knowledge. And what if I told you that we had already seen that reality? What if I told you that we had already measured the true, final threat to all organized life in this galactic arm, and that your border war is nothing more than a localized, destructive tantrum that is actively preventing the only possible solution to the true cosmic catastrophe? This rhetorical question hung in the air, heavy and absolute, preparing the ground for the third and final act of the Sol revelation, the great, terrifying twist that retroactively justified every single decision the humans had made. Liana signaled to a console, and the panoramic view of Earth on the central screen dissolved, replaced by a visualization that was so vast, so cosmically terrifying, that it silenced even the rigidly controlled Cathar delegates and sent a fresh wave of paralyzing fear through Caithar's segmented spine. The projection showed a map of the entire galactic arm, stretching far beyond the compact's known borders and the disputed territories. Superimposed on this map was an ancient, almost imperceptible phenomenon, a slow-moving, dark-energy anomaly that spanned light years, traveling along the faint, prestellar dust lanes, expanding with an inexorable, terrifying indifference. It was not a fleet, not a civilization, and not a resource war. It was a cosmic shadow, an absolute nullification of structured matter, a wave of reverse entropy that erased existence by simply making complexity unstable. We call this phenomenon the Great Silence, Liana stated, her voice dropping to a near whisper that nonetheless carried the weight of planetary doom and the vastness of cosmic scale. It is a localized, cyclical collapse of organized baryonic matter, a massive wave front of anti-anthropic decay caused by the accumulated, ancient energy outputs of every civilization in this arm for the past 10 million years. Failed mega-engineering projects, uncontrolled dark matter experiments, and simply the sheer, staggering, inefficient waste of every war fought across the millennia, all of it has accumulated, creating an instability in the void itself. It is a slow, self-correcting feedback loop, the universe wiping the slate clean of all the mess we have collectively made. It is coming, strategos, not quickly but inevitably. Its vanguard will reach the compact's core sectors in approximately 350 Sol cycles, and no amount of firepower will slow its advance. She paused, allowing the cosmic scale of the threat to permeate the consciousness of the alien delegates, letting them feel the cold, absolute truth of the universe's indifference. We knew about this threat 2 centuries ago when our new deep space sensor arrays, built not to track enemies, but to map the underlying cosmic physics and the long-term energy budget of our galactic neighborhood, first detected the anomaly. We analyzed the physics, calculated the propagation, and realized one simple, terrifying truth: no military solution exists. No fleet, no weapon, no territorial gain can stop a fundamental collapse of physics. The only solution is an immense, coordinated, interspecies engineering effort to counteract the decay with a synchronized, opposite field energy projection that must be generated at multiple, stable points across the entire galactic arm. A project that requires the total, unified, nonviolent commitment of every single resource. Liana finally made the ultimate connection, the full, crushing weight of the Sol system's decision, the sublime, terrifying logic of their isolation. That is why we refused your war, Strategos Caithar. That is why we would not send a single resource, a single ship, a single mine to your petty, self-destructive border skirmishes. The Compact was fighting a war of distraction, a war of fear, while the true enemy was on the horizon, an enemy that demanded the complete, unified, non-military dedication of all our species' capacity. Our entire orbital infrastructure, the garden you came to scorch, is not a planetary defense system. It is one of the final, massive components of the Silence Counter-Initiative, an immense, stellar-scale energy accumulator and resonator, built over 2 centuries, designed to project the necessary anti-entropic field. We needed every single joule of energy, every single engineered element, every single focused mind. To join your war was to condemn the entire galactic arm, including ourselves, to the coming silence through the wasteful consumption of the very resources required for salvation. The chamber was gripped by a silence that was far more profound than the one Liana had described, the silence of absolute philosophical defeat. The Caithar delegation, creatures of iron will and cold logic, finally understood the full, terrifying logic of the human choice. They had mistaken quiet focus for weakness and ethical commitment for naivete. They had been prepared to destroy the only civilization that held the key to universal survival, all for the sake of maintaining a fragile, fear-based political order. The war they had initiated was the single most self-destructive act in the history of the Compact. Caithar, his segmented body trembling slightly, stood up from his seat, his gaze fixed on the slow-moving, dark horror on the screen. His voice was barely a whisper, the voice of a man whose entire life's purpose had just been revealed as a tragic, pointless distraction. The Compact, it would have been shattered by this knowledge. We would have consumed ourselves with fear, diverting all our resources into building weapons against a threat that cannot be shot. You chose to carry this burden in absolute silence, in ethical isolation, rather than risk the panic and resource diversion that would doom the counter-effort. The sheer moral and intellectual weight of that decision is unquantifiable. We made an ethical calculation of utility, strategos, Liana confirmed, her head tilted slightly, an expression of immense, solitary responsibility etched on her face. The probability of the Compact successfully coordinating a peaceful, unified, 2-century-long engineering project was near zero. Fear, greed, and political fragmentation would have ensured failure. The probability of us successfully completing our core component in isolation, and then using the power of our completed system to force the Compact into cooperation, was mathematically higher. We needed the element of surprise. We needed to be underestimated. We needed to appear merely unpredictable, rather than the holders of a terrifying, cosmic truth that would have ignited a panicked, resource-consuming arms race. The human representative then offered the final, absolute truth, a gesture of ethical diplomacy that transcended any political act of the hegemony. You brought a war to our home, strategos. We have neutralized your capacity for violence and subjugated your fleet without firing a single lethal shot. We are now the power and control of this system, and you are our captives. We will not demand tribute. We will not demand territorial concessions. We will not install a provisional government. Our only demand is cooperation, absolute and unwavering, toward the solution of the real problem. Liana projected a new set of data onto the screen, detailed schematics for the remaining Silence Counter-Initiative nodes that needed to be built in the Compact's core sectors, and the specific technological upgrades needed to make the hegemony's shipyards capable of producing the necessary materials. This was the forced unification, the ultimate ethical coercion. You came here to force us into your war. We have instead forced you into ours, she stated. The war against the inevitable, against the chaos of the cosmos. Your fleet is inert, but your engineers are not. Your resources are now ours, but only for the purpose of protecting your own civilization. We will release your vessels and share the full, terrifying sensor data and countermodels with the Compact, but only when you formally agree, under the observation of our full, systemic-scale energy projectors, to dedicate your entire political and material capital to the Silence Counter-Initiative. The time for fear is over. The time for work has begun. The Caithar delegates, their arrogance replaced by a profound, humbled awe, stood in silence, each of them undergoing a massive psychological reorientation. They had come to conquer a single, defiant world, and had instead stumbled into a civilization that was quietly, competently fighting a war for the soul of the cosmos itself. The humans had refused to fight the galaxy's war of fear, and had instead, through their calm, ethical, and superior commitment to a greater truth, forced the galaxy to fight their war of survival. The silent commitment was signed, and the hegemony, in the most profound act of submission imaginable, swore its allegiance to the quiet logic of the Sol stewardship. Proconsul Valoris, receiving the full, unvarnished report from Caithar through a secured, scrambled channel, the same channel that simultaneously carried Liana's full, devastating presentation to the Grand Conclave, felt the low-frequency hum of the conclave floor in a new, terrifying light. It no longer represented the solemnity of power, but the fragile, ignorant tremor of a system about to be entirely, fundamentally broken and rebuilt. The hegemony, which prided itself on stability and control, was about to be politically, militarily, and philosophically annihilated by a species that had simply chosen to be better, a species whose greatest weapon was its ethics. The final, terrifying clarity of the human position dissolved the compact's political structure in a single, silent moment of truth. The final broadcast of the Sol stewardship, transmitted to every recognized sentient species across the known quadrant, was not a declaration of victory, but an invitation to unity, an imperative for collaboration. Representative Liana, her calm demeanor now embodying the collective maturity of her species, stood before the immense, humming light of the completed Silence Counter-Initiative Orbital Array, the same array the hegemony had tried to vaporize, and addressed the watching, terrified galaxy. "We have entered a new epoch of shared existence," Liana's voice resonated across the interstellar void, a beacon of clarity and immense, quiet power. "The Sol stewardship is not an empire. We are not a compact. We are a unified civilization that has completed its initial task of internal and systemic stabilization. The conflict brought to our home has served its purpose. It has allowed us to demonstrate that the politics of fear and scarcity are obsolete, and that the dedication of planetary effort to existence is the only valid form of defense. Your war is over, and your energy and focus are now required for the next, inevitable, and shared challenge." The sheer sincerity of her voice carried more binding power than all the compact's threat matrices combined. The immediate aftermath was, predictably, political chaos within the compact, the slow, grinding process of dismantling centuries of fear-based governance, and replacing it with the brutal, unifying logic of cosmic necessity. The hegemony, utterly humiliated and stripped of its military authority, became the primary executor of the Sol-directed Silence Counter-Initiative, the ultimate irony of their aggressive ambition. Caithar and his senior staff, now stationed on Earth and working alongside human engineers, found a strange, profound peace in the absolute clarity of their new mission. They were no longer fighting a pointless war of territorial gain. They were fighting for the soul of the galactic arm, guided by the quiet, unrelenting competence of the humans. Caithar, now an elderly, respected figure in the new, nascent interspecies coordinating body, a body that functioned on the Sol principles of absolute resource transparency, stood one day on the surface of Mars, now a partially terraformed, breathable environment thanks to a Sol engineering project that had harnessed a core of the same technology that had neutralized his fleet. He watched a massive, segmented transport vessel, now emblazoned with the combined Sol compact insignia, lift off, carrying the final components for the counter-initiative's third node, destined for the former border sectors of the compact, the very location where the meaningless war had once raged. He spoke to Representative Liana, who now functioned as the de facto diplomatic anchor of the galactic arm, not through coercion, but through the moral and technological weight of Sol's leadership. "We misjudged you completely, Liana. We saw your refusal as arrogance, non-participation as weakness, and your focus on your world as selfish isolation. In truth, you simply operated on a scale of foresight and responsibility we could not even perceive. You were not fighting a war against us. You were simply waiting for us to exhaust our destructive impulse so that you could finally force us to look up and see the true grand project, the true enemy. Your silence was a greater weapon than any plasma cannon." Liana stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the rising transport, her posture still carrying the same calm certainty. The scale of responsibility must always match the scale of the threat, strategos. Our history taught us that fear is the greatest corrosive to progress. We learned that the only way to stop fighting each other was to dedicate every resource to making the prospect of fighting irrelevant to the true challenges of existence. The Great Silence Counterinitiative took an entire century to complete, a testament to the immense undertaking and the fragile, hard-won unity of the former compact. The combined effort, powered by the core energy principles pioneered by Saul, resulted in a network of stability arrays that successfully generated the anti-entropic field, effectively halting the advancement of the cosmic decay front and saving an entire galactic arm from slow, silent oblivion. It was the greatest engineering feat in the recorded history of the quadrant, a testament not to the power of a single species, but to the collective, desperate logic of shared survival, forged in the fires of the war brought to Earth. The war the hegemony had brought to Earth had become the catalyst for the galaxy's ultimate salvation. Yet the victory over the Great Silence was not the end of the Saul revelation, but the true beginning of the ultimate twist, the final, terrifying moment of realization that redefined the very purpose of existence. The stabilization field was fully activated. The cosmic decay was neutralized. The former compact, now the unified armed stewardship, breathed a collective, universal sigh of relief, ready to begin the long, necessary work of rebuilding their cultures on the new, scarcity-free principles taught by Saul. It was in this moment of collective triumph that the deepest, most hidden sensor array of the Saul system, the true core of the technology that had first detected the silence, registered an entirely new, unquantifiable signal. The array, a massive instrument buried within the Saul star's corona itself, designed to measure fundamental fluctuations in the local geometry of space-time, received a rhythmic pattern that had simply manifested. The signal was not a product of the silence, nor of the compact's former enemies, nor of any known physical law. It was a rhythmic, incredibly ancient and highly complex transmission that emanated not from the physical space of the galactic arm, but from the void between the arms, an unimaginable gulf of space and time that defied all previous notions of distance. It was a message from beyond the known frontier, a deliberate beacon from a civilization that had transcended the conventional universe. The signal contained only two elements: a vast, complex mathematical structure that defied conventional physics and described a method for altering the fundamental dimensionality of space, and a single, profound philosophical question repeated in every known mathematical notation. Representative Liana, now a figure of near-mythic stature, oversaw the translation, working in the central command nexus of the unified species, a station orbiting Earth that was now the diplomatic and scientific heart of the quadrant. The finest minds of the former compact species labored alongside the quiet competence of the human scientists, all of them humbled apprentices in a new, shared reality, grappling with mathematics that spoke of 7 and 8 dimensions. After a long, silent cycle of analysis, the core of the message was finally decrypted, a message so old it predated the formation of the hegemony itself by eons. It was a communication from a civilization that had transcended the entire concept of the physical domain, a species that had long ago faced the same ultimate existential threat, the Great Silence, and had overcome it not by stopping it, but by escaping it through a controlled, collective ascension to a higher dimensional state. The mathematical structure was a blueprint for localized, interdimensional transportation, a method of lifting an entire stellar system out of the three-dimensional space of the galactic arm and into a higher, more stable geometric domain, a pocket of ethical space, protected from the entropic decay and the cyclical violence of the observable universe. It was the ultimate final frontier, the only true form of permanent, absolute stability. The philosophical question, translated and projected onto the unified command matrix in simple, elegant script, was the ultimate final testament of the Huma. And Journey, the question that settled the matter of their destiny. It read, "You have achieved systemic stability. You have mastered the fear of the self. You have overcome the chaos of the cosmos. The next choice is not to fight the chaos of the wider universe, but to transcend it. We offer the final frontier. We offer the passage beyond the physical reality that binds you to ultimate decay and conflict. The question is this: having won the fight for your world, are you now ready to abandon it for the unknown, eternal cosmos?" The humans had refused to fight a meaningless war only to be drawn into an essential one. They had won that essential war, uniting a fractured, fearful galaxy. Now, the final cosmic twist, the message from beyond, offered them, and the entire unified stewardship, a choice that transcended all previous notions of power, territory, and even survival. It was the ultimate test of the human spirit, the choice to leave the safe, stable garden they had built at the cost of so much silence, so much sacrifice, and so much wisdom for the entirely unknown, eternal possibility of the greater, transdimensional cosmos. The decision was not one of fear, but of endless curiosity. Caithar, standing beside Liana, his ancient, complex eyes filled with a new, terrifying hope, watched as the human representative looked up at the translated question, the final, absolute challenge from the universe. He knew with the total certainty of a warrior who had learned the true meaning of peace that the humans would not choose the safety of the garden. They had transcended fear. They had solved the problem of survival. Their destiny lay in the unknown, and with them, the destiny of the unified galaxy, now their willing apprentices, would follow. The end of conflict was not the end of the journey. It was merely the point of origin for the true, infinite exploration, the final, absolute ascension of the ethical mind over the limits of the physical universe. The war that had been brought to Earth had done more than save the galaxy from itself. It had paved the way for its ascension to the unimaginable. The long, profound silence in the unified command nexus, broken only by the quiet hum of the perfect, efficient Sol technology, was the most cinematic sound of all.